Friends, have you ever heard a name that sent shivers down the spine of an entire continent? A name that made kings tremble on their thrones and redrew the map of Europe with a sword. Today, we're talking about one of history's most brilliant, ambitious, and terrifying figures, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who became Europe's nightmare. So, how did a young officer from the small island of Corsica rise to become the master of a continent? Let's rewind the clock. France, in the late 18th century, was in chaos. The French Revolution had overthrown the monarchy, but what followed was a period of instability and fear known as the Reign of Terror. The nation was desperate for a savior, a strong leader who could restore order and glory. And right on cue, a military genius stepped onto the stage. Napoleon wasn't just a good general, he was a phenomenon. He first grabbed the spotlight with his stunning victories in Italy, using revolutionary tactics that left the old, rigid armies of Austria and its allies utterly bewildered. He moved his troops with lightning speed, lived off the land, and struck where his enemies least expected. He was a master of psychology, inspiring fanatical loyalty in his soldiers, who affectionately called him the Little Corporal. For them, he was the embodiment of the revolution's promise. That talent, not birth, was what truly mattered. With his popularity soaring, Napoleon returned to Paris. In 1799, through a brilliant and daring political maneuver coup d'etat, he seized power, eventually crowning himself Emperor of the French in 1804. This wasn't just a power grab, it was a declaration. Napoleon wasn't just ruling France. He intended to reshape Europe in his image. The monarchies of Europe, who had watched the French Revolution with horror, now faced an even greater threat. A revolutionary emperor with the most powerful army in the world at his command. What followed was over a decade of non-stop conflict, the Napoleonic Wars. Look at this map. At the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, often called his masterpiece, Napoleon crushed the combined armies of Russia and Austria. He was outnumbered, but with brilliant strategy, he lured his enemies into a trap and achieved a victory so decisive it shattered the Third Coalition against him. He dismantled the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire, creating new kingdoms and installing his brothers and marshals as their rulers. Spain, Italy, Germany all fell under his influence. He was playing chess with nations, and the old royal houses were merely his pawns. But what made him a nightmare? It wasn't just his military genius. It was the ideas he spread. Everywhere his grand army marched, it brought with it the principles of the French Revolution. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a revolutionary legal framework that guaranteed things like religious toleration and the abolition of feudal privileges. For the common people, this was a glimpse of a new, more equal world. But for the kings, emperors, and aristocrats of Prussia, Austria, and Russia, this was poison. Napoleon wasn't just conquering their lands, he was exporting a revolution that threatened their very existence, their entire way of life. They saw him as a monster, an upstart commoner tearing down the divinely ordained order of things. Of course, Napoleon's ambition knew no bounds, and that would be his undoing. His attempt to cripple Britain through a continent-wide economic blockade. The continental system backfired. It caused widespread hardship and resentment. Then came his most fatal mistake, the invasion of Russia in 1812. He led the largest European army ever assembled. Over 500,000 men, deep into the vast Russian plains. But the Russians refused to give him the decisive battle he craved. Instead, they retreated, burning their own cities and countryside, leaving nothing for his army to live on. The brutal Russian winter did the rest. Trapped hundreds of miles from home, with no food and inadequate clothing, the Grand Army was annihilated. Of the more than 500,000 who invaded, fewer than 100,000 staggered back. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. Seeing their chance, the nations of Europe, Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Britain formed a grand coalition. They cornered him at the massive Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the Battle of Nations, and defeated him. Forced back into France, Napoleon fought with his old brilliance but was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. In 1814, he was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the tiny island of Elba. Europe's nightmare was over, ... or so they thought. In one of the most audacious comebacks in history, Napoleon escaped from Elba after less than a year. He landed in France, and the army sent to arrest him defected to his side. The king fled, and Napoleon triumphantly returned to Paris without firing a single shot. For a period known as the 100 Days, the nightmare returned. Europe scrambled to assemble its armies once more for a final showdown. That final confrontation came in June 1815, on a muddy field in modern-day Belgium, Waterloo. It was a clash of Titans Napoleon against the British Duke of Wellington and the Prussian Gebhard von Blücher. It was a brutal, close-run battle that could have gone either way. For hours, Napoleon's forces hammered the Allied lines. But Wellington's troops held on with grim determination, and the timely arrival of the Prussian army turned the tide. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite, made their last stand and were broken. The Emperor's final gamble had failed. This time, there would be no second chances. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote, windswept rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, where he would die 6 years later. The old monarchies were restored, and the map of Europe was redrawn once again at the Congress of Vienna in a desperate attempt to turn back the clock and erase the memory of Napoleon. But they couldn't. Napoleon's legacy was too powerful. He was a tyrant and a conqueror whose wars cost millions of lives. But he was also a modernizer and a liberator who tore down the old feudal world and paved the way for modern Europe. He was a complex, contradictory figure, part hero, part villain, a nightmare to the old order, and for many, a symbol of ambition and glory. He changed the world forever, proving that a single individual, driven by incredible talent and limitless ambition, could indeed become the master and the nightmare of a continent. What do you think? Was Napoleon a great hero or a terrible villain? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's a debate that still rages on today. Thanks so much for joining me on this historical journey. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the past. See you next time.